The backyard of my parents' Victorian mansion had been transformed into something out of a fairy tale for their 25th wedding anniversary celebration. White silk draping hung between ancient oak trees, thousands of twinkling lights created a canopy of stars, and round tables draped in ivory linen dotted the perfectly manicured lawn. The florist had outdone herself with arrangements of white roses and peonies that probably cost more than most people's monthly rent. 150 of the most influential people in our affluent suburb had gathered to celebrate Robert and Margaret Carter's silver anniversary. Local politicians mingled with successful business owners, prominent attorneys chatted with renowned doctors, and the kind of old money families who appeared in society magazines every month raised crystal glasses of Dom Perignon in honor of one of their most respected couples. And there I was, standing near the dessert table in my simple black dress from Target, feeling like an imposter at my own parents' celebration. Jessica. My mother's voice carried across the garden with the practiced projection of someone accustomed to commanding attention at social gatherings. Margaret Carter approached me with her signature smile, the one she wore for charity galas and political fundraisers, perfect and polished and somehow cold around the edges. "There you are, darling," she said, air-kissing my cheek without actually making contact. "I've been looking everywhere for you. Mrs. Pemberton was just asking about your little real estate venture." The way she said little real estate venture made it sound like a lemonade stand. Mrs. Pemberton, the wife of the county's most successful developer, turned toward me with polite interest. She was wearing a dress that probably cost more than my monthly grocery budget and jewelry that could fund a small country's infrastructure. "How exciting, dear," Mrs. Pemberton said with the kind of enthusiasm one might show for a child's art project. "Margaret tells me you're getting your feet wet in property management. Such a practical field for young women these days." Before I could respond, Mom jumped in with her perfectly rehearsed explanation. "Jessica's been learning the business from the ground up. You know how important it is for young people to understand hard work. She's been doing property maintenance, tenant relations, that sort of thing. Very hands-on experience." The way she described it made me sound like a glorified janitor, which wasn't entirely inaccurate. I had spent plenty of time fixing leaky faucets and painting apartments over the past 7 years. But it wasn't exactly the complete picture either. "How wonderful," Mrs. Pemberton nodded approvingly. "And which properties are you managing?" "I work with residential complexes mainly," I replied carefully. "Apartment buildings, rental properties, some commercial spaces." "Oh, like those little apartment complexes on the east side of town?" Mrs. Pemberton's tone suggested she was trying to be encouraging about what was obviously a modest beginning to a potentially promising career. "Among others," I said neutrally. Mom's smile tightened almost imperceptibly. She'd coached me extensively on how to discuss my work at social gatherings like this, emphasize the learning experience, downplay the actual responsibilities, and never, ever mention specific properties or income figures that might make people uncomfortable. According to Mom, the last thing anyone wanted to hear at a cocktail party was detailed information about apartment maintenance or rental yields. Better to keep things vague and focus on the character-building aspects of starting at the bottom and working my way up. "Well," Mrs. Pemberton said with finality, "I'm sure you're learning valuable lessons about responsibility and client service. Those skills will serve you well when you're ready to move into more substantial properties." The implication was clear. What I was doing now was practice for the real work I'd hopefully graduate to someday. Mom nodded enthusiastically, clearly pleased with how the conversation was going. "That's exactly what we've told her," Mom agreed. "Jessica's always been very practical. Not everyone can jump straight into high-end developments like your husband's projects, Eleanor. Sometimes we need to start small and work our way up." I excused myself and walked toward the bar, needing something to steady my nerves. The bartender, a professional I recognized from other upscale events in our area, smiled as he prepared my drink. "Tough crowd tonight?" he asked quietly, clearly having overheard at least part of the conversation. "Family gatherings usually are," I replied, accepting the glass of wine gratefully. "I've worked a lot of these society parties," he said, polishing glasses with practiced efficiency. "Amazing how people can make assumptions about someone's life based on a 30-second conversation." Before I could respond, I spotted my father working his way through the crowd toward me. Robert Carter commanded attention wherever he went, At 6'2" with silver hair and the confident bearing of someone accustomed to being the most successful person in any room, he was exactly what central casting would order if they needed someone to play a wealthy businessman. Jessica. Dad's voice boomed with the hearty enthusiasm he used for client presentations and political fundraisers. There's my girl. Come on, I want you to meet some people. He guided me through the crowd to where a group of his golf buddies stood discussing whatever it was that successful middle-aged men discussed at cocktail parties, probably market trends, political developments, and whose son had just gotten into which Ivy League school. Gentlemen, Dad announced, I'd like you to meet my daughter Jessica. She's in real estate now, following in the old man's footsteps, you might say. The group turned their attention to me with polite interest. I recognized most of them from previous social gatherings: doctors, attorneys, business owners, the kind of men who served on hospital boards and country club committees. Real estate, eh? Said Dr. Martinez, a cardiologist whose practice served half the wealthy families in our county. Excellent field for a young woman. Flexible hours, good people skills required. What kind of properties are you working with? Residential mainly, I replied. Apartment complexes, rental properties. Ah, getting started with the bread and butter stuff, nodded James Morrison, who owned the largest insurance agency in the region. Smart approach. Learn the fundamentals with smaller properties, then work your way up to the luxury market. That's exactly the plan, Dad agreed enthusiastically. I've always told Jessica that you have to understand the business from the ground up. She's been doing maintenance work, dealing with tenants, learning how the industry really operates. None of this jumping straight to the executive level without understanding what the work actually involves. The men nodded approvingly. This was exactly the kind of character-building, pay-your-dues approach they'd recommend for their own children. How many units are you managing now? Asked Robert Kim, a successful attorney who specialized in corporate law. About 800 units currently, I replied. There was a brief pause as they processed this number. 800 rental units was significantly more than what they'd been expecting based on Dad's description of my entry-level learning experience. 800. Dr. Martinez repeated. That's quite substantial for someone just starting out. Well, Dad said with a slightly forced laugh, I may have helped her get connected with some larger property management companies. Family connections, you know how it is. I felt that familiar knot in my stomach. The one that came whenever my family felt the need to explain away anything that didn't fit their narrative about my modest, character-building career in property management. My phone buzzed with a text from Marcus, my property development partner. Maple Street deal closed 20 minutes ago. Congratulations on becoming the largest residential property owner in the county. Celebration dinner tomorrow? I quickly silenced my phone and slipped it back into my purse, but not before Dad noticed the interruption. Jessica, phone away during conversations, he said with the mild reproach of someone accustomed to being obeyed. These gentlemen are interested in hearing about your work, not whatever text messages you're getting from your property management company. Of course, sorry. I put my phone on silent, though it continued buzzing with what I assumed were more congratulations from my team about the acquisition we'd just completed. Now then, Dad continued, tell them about some of the challenges you've been dealing with. The tenant relations, the maintenance issues, the day-to-day realities of property management. He wanted me to tell war stories about fixing broken toilets and dealing with difficult renters, the kinds of relatable, character-building anecdotes that would demonstrate I was learning the business properly from the bottom up. The truth was, I had plenty of those stories. I'd spent the first 3 years of building my property empire doing exactly that kind of hands-on work, learning every aspect of residential real estate from the ground floor up. But I'd also moved far beyond that level years ago, and continuing to present myself as someone still learning the basics was becoming increasingly uncomfortable. Actually, I began, the most interesting challenge recently has been coordinating major renovations across multiple properties simultaneously. When you're dealing with that many units, the logistics become quite complex. Multiple properties? Robert Kim looked intrigued. How many buildings are we talking about? Before I could answer, Mom appeared at my elbow with the determined efficiency of someone on a rescue mission. Jessica, she said brightly, I need you to help me with something in the house. Ladies' Committee emergency. It was clearly an extraction, designed to remove me from a conversation that was heading in directions Mom found uncomfortable. I excused myself and followed her through the crowd toward the house. What committee emergency? I asked once we were inside. There is no emergency, she replied curtly. I just thought it was best to get you away from Dad's friends before you said something unfortunate. Unfortunate how? She stopped walking and turned to face me, her expression a mixture of frustration and something that might have been maternal concern. Jessica, honey, you were starting to make it sound like you manage more properties than you actually do. These are very successful, very sophisticated businessmen. They'll see right through any exaggeration, and it reflects poorly on our family when you oversell your accomplishments. I wasn't exaggerating anything. 800 units? Multiple properties with major renovations? Jessica, I know you're proud of the work you're doing and you should be. But there's a difference between confidence and overstatement. I stared at her, trying to process the assumption underlying her concern. She genuinely believed that I was inflating my role and responsibilities because she couldn't reconcile the scope of work I was describing with her image of me as someone learning the basics of property management. Mom, what if I told you that everything I said was completely accurate? Then I'd say you're working for a very large property management company, and you should be clearer about the distinction between properties you manage for someone else and properties you actually own or control yourself. The distinction she was drawing was reasonable under normal circumstances. Most people in property management did work for companies that owned the buildings, rather than owning them personally. It was a natural assumption to make. The problem was it wasn't accurate in my case. What if I told you, I said carefully, that I do own them? That I've been buying and renovating residential properties for the past 7 years, and I now own 42 apartment buildings containing just over 800 rental units. She laughed, not cruelly, but with the kind of gentle amusement one might show to a child who claimed to have flown to the moon. Jessica, sweetheart, do you have any idea how much money it would take to own 800 rental units? We're talking about tens of millions of dollars in real estate. Actually, we're talking about closer to $67 million in current market value. Her smile faded. What did you say? My property portfolio is currently valued at $67 million. That's after the acquisition that closed today, which added another 14 buildings to my holdings. Mom stared at me for a long moment, her expression cycling through confusion, disbelief, and something that might have been panic. Jessica, this isn't funny. I'm not joking. You can't possibly own $67 million worth of real estate. You drive a 10-year-old Honda. You live in that little apartment above the dry cleaner. You shop at Target. I drive a Honda because it's reliable and fuel efficient. I live simply because I reinvest most of my profits back into acquiring more properties. And I shop at Target because expensive clothes don't make my tenants' rent checks any larger. She was shaking her head frantically now. This is impossible. Jessica, if you owned that much property, I'd be what? You'd be one of the wealthiest people in this county. I didn't respond, letting the silence stretch between us as she processed the implications of what I'd just told her. You're telling me, she said slowly, that while your father and I have been explaining to everyone that you're learning the property management business, you've actually been building a real estate empire worth tens of millions of dollars? That's exactly what I'm telling you. Before she could respond, Dad's voice boomed from the back door. Margaret. Jessica. You're missing the toasts. We returned to the garden, where Dad had taken the microphone from the band and was addressing the gathered crowd. The golden hour light was perfect, the champagne was flowing, and 150 of the most prominent people in our community were focused on celebrating 25 years of Carter family success. Ladies and gentlemen, Dad was saying, his voice carrying easily across the garden, thank you all for being here tonight to celebrate this milestone with Margaret and me. 25 years of marriage feels like both a lifetime and just the beginning. Polite applause rippled through the crowd. We've been blessed with success in business, blessed with wonderful friends and community connections, and most importantly, blessed with family. He gestured toward where Mom and I stood near the edge of the gathering. Our daughter Jessica represents the next generation of Carter achievement. She's building her own career in real estate, learning the business the right way, from the ground up, with hard work and determination rather than shortcuts or handouts. More applause, warmer this time. I could see people nodding approvingly at this description of the young Carter daughter who was paying her dues and learning valuable life lessons through honest work. Jessica embodies the values Margaret and I have tried to instill, Dad continued. The importance of earning success rather than expecting it, of understanding your industry from every angle, of building something meaningful through dedication and perseverance. He raised his champagne glass toward me. To Jessica, and to the example she sets for young people everywhere about the rewards of hard work and humility. The crowd turned to applaud me, and I found myself the center of attention at a celebration of values I supposedly embodied but hadn't actually demonstrated in the way they imagined. Because while Dad was praising me for learning the business from the ground up, what he didn't know was that I'd already mastered it and moved far beyond the entry-level work he thought I was still doing. While he was celebrating my humility and dedication to earning success rather than expecting it, what he didn't realize was that I'd earned more success than anyone at this party could imagine. I just hadn't told them about it. And while he was holding me up as an example of building something meaningful through hard work, what he couldn't see was that I'd built something so meaningful it dwarfed most of the achievements being celebrated tonight. My phone rang. In the middle of Dad's toast with 150 people applauding my supposed humility and work ethic, my phone started ringing with the distinctive tone I'd assigned to business calls. "Jessica," Mom hissed under her breath, "turn that off immediately." But something made me look at the caller ID. It was David Richardson, the real estate attorney who'd been handling today's acquisition. The largest purchase in my company's history, the deal that had made me the single largest residential property owner in the county. Dad had paused his toast, and people were starting to turn toward the source of the interruption. The polite thing to do would be to silence the call and apologize for the disruption. Instead, I answered it. "Hello, David." "Jessica. Congratulations. I just left the closing. Everything went perfectly. You are now the proud owner of the entire Maple Street complex. 14 buildings, 236 units, prime location. This makes you the largest residential property owner in the county, and frankly, one of the most significant real estate investors in the state." The garden had gone completely silent. 150 people were staring at me as David's voice carried clearly in the still evening air. "The total purchase price came to $18.7 million, he continued, "and with your existing portfolio, your total holdings are now valued at just over $67 million. Jessica, you've built something extraordinary." Dad's champagne glass had frozen halfway to his lips. Mom looked like she'd been struck by lightning. Around the garden, I could see people leaning forward, straining to hear every word of this conversation that was clearly not what anyone had been expecting. "Should I put you on speaker, David?" I asked calmly. "If you'd like," he replied, clearly confused by the background noise he was hearing. "Is this a bad time?" "No, it's perfect timing actually." I held my phone up so his voice would carry clearly across the garden. "David, could you repeat what you just told me? About the purchase and my total holdings." There was a brief pause as he processed this unusual request, but David had been my attorney long enough to trust my judgment. "Of course. You just purchased the Maple Street complex for $18.7 million, which brings your total real estate portfolio to 42 buildings containing 814 rental units, with a combined market value of $67.3 million. This acquisition makes you the largest residential property owner in the county." The silence that followed was so complete I could hear the soft jazz music from the band's speakers 3 gardens away. "Jessica," David's voice continued from the speaker, "I have to say what you've built over the past 7 years is remarkable. Starting with that first duplex you bought with your savings from waiting tables, reinvesting every penny of profit, working 18-hour days doing your own maintenance and renovations. It's exactly the kind of success story that proves what's possible with vision and determination." Dad's mouth was opening and closing without sound. Mom had gone completely pale. Around the garden, 150 of our community's most successful people were staring at me with expressions ranging from bewilderment to something that might have been awe. "Thank you, David," I said calmly. "Could you email me the final paperwork? I'll review everything tomorrow." "Absolutely. And Jessica, congratulations again. You should be incredibly proud of what you've accomplished." I hung up and slipped my phone back into my purse. The garden remained silent with all eyes focused on me. Finally, Dad found his voice. "Jessica, what was that?" "That was my attorney confirming the purchase of $18.7 million worth of real estate that I bought today." "You bought?" His voice trailed off as he tried to process this information. The entire Maple Street complex. 14 apartment buildings. It brings my total holdings to $67 million in residential real estate. Mom's champagne glass slipped from her fingers and shattered on the brick patio. The sound seemed to break the spell that had fallen over the garden, and suddenly everyone was talking at once. Did she say $67 million? The largest property owner in the county? But she's so young. I thought she was just learning the business. Mrs. Pemberton pushed through the crowd toward me, her earlier condescension replaced by something that looked like panic. Jessica dear, when I asked about your little real estate venture, you didn't mention that you owned, that you had built. You didn't ask what I owned, I replied calmly. You asked what I was managing. I manage 42 buildings. I just happen to own them all. Dad was still standing with the microphone in his hand, his toast forgotten as he tried to reconcile the daughter he thought he knew with the information he'd just heard. $67 million, he said weakly. Give or take a few million depending on market conditions. But Jessica, you live in that little apartment. You drive that old car. You shop at Target, yes. Because I'm focused on building wealth, not displaying it. Every dollar I don't spend on luxury is a dollar I can reinvest in acquiring more properties. Mom had recovered enough to speak, though her voice was shaky. How long? How long have you been? How long has this been going on? I bought my first property 7 years ago. A duplex that needed extensive renovation. I've been reinvesting profits and expanding ever since. 7 years. Dad's voice was strangled. You've been building a real estate empire for 7 years while we thought you were learning basic property management? I was learning basic property management. I was also applying what I learned to build something bigger. The crowd was pressing closer now, everyone straining to hear this conversation that had transformed from a family toast into the most dramatic revelation in our community's recent history. Jessica, said James Morrison, the insurance executive who'd been patronizing me an hour earlier, when you said you managed 800 units, you thought I worked for someone else who owned them. I understand the confusion. Dr. Martinez stepped forward, his earlier dismissive attitude replaced by obvious respect. Miss Carter, if you own that much residential property, you're not just learning the real estate business, you've mastered it. You're operating at a level that most developers never reach. Thank you. But why didn't you tell us? Mrs. Pemberton asked, her voice plaintive. Why let us think you were just starting out when you've built something so extraordinary? I looked around at the faces surrounding me, people who had spent the evening celebrating my parents' success while politely tolerating what they thought was my modest attempt to build a career in their shadow. Because I wanted to see how you'd treat me when you thought I was unsuccessful. The words hung in the garden air like a challenge. Jessica, Mom said quietly, we've always supported you. We've always been proud of your work ethic and determination. Have you? Because 20 minutes ago, you were worried that I was exaggerating my accomplishments. You thought I needed to be rescued from a conversation where I might oversell myself to Dad's friends. We were trying to protect you. From what? From people finding out I was more successful than they expected? From making Dad's golf buddies uncomfortable by achieving something that didn't fit their assumptions about what a young woman just learning the business should have accomplished. Dad had finally set down the microphone, but his voice still carried clearly across the garden. We didn't know, Jessica. We had no idea you were building something this significant. You didn't know because you never asked. You saw what you expected to see. Your daughter learning the family business, starting small, paying her dues. You never considered that what looked like paying dues might actually be building an empire. But you never told us, Mom protested. You never explained what you were really doing. I told you I was buying properties. I told you I was expanding my holdings. I told you the work required all my time and attention. What I didn't tell you was exactly how much success I was having because I wanted to see if you could be proud of me for working hard, regardless of the results. The garden had gone quiet again as everyone processed this exchange. These were people accustomed to being the most successful individuals in any room, and they were realizing that the young woman they'd been politely tolerating had achieved something beyond most of their accomplishments. Jessica, Dad said, his voice heavy with something that might have been regret, if we had known. If you had known, you would have treated me differently. You would have introduced me as your successful daughter instead of your daughter who was learning to be successful. You would have bragged about my achievements instead of praising my work ethic. You would have used my success to enhance your own reputation instead of being mildly embarrassed by what you thought was my lack of achievement. That's not fair, Mom said, but her voice lacked conviction. Isn't it? Because right now I can see you recalculating. I can see you figuring out how to present this information to your friends, how to take credit for raising such a successful daughter, how to use my achievements to enhance the Carter family reputation. She flinched like I'd slapped her. My phone buzzed with another text from Marcus. CNN Money wants to do a story about your acquisition. Youngest woman to own 800+ rental units in the state. Should I schedule the interview? I showed the text to Dad. This is what my success actually looks like. Not learning basic property management, reshaping the residential real estate market in our region. Dad stared at the phone, then at me, then at the crowd of people who were hanging on every word of this conversation. Jessica, he said quietly, I owe you an apology. We owe you an apology. For what? For not seeing what you were building. For assuming we understood your work without asking the right questions. For being satisfied with our assumptions instead of being curious about your actual achievements. It was a start, but it wasn't enough. Dad, 3 hours ago you were holding me up as an example of humility and learning from the ground up. But what you were really celebrating was your assumption that I wasn't too successful, that I was still in a position where you could guide and advise me, where your achievements still dwarfed mine. That's not true, he protested, but I could see in his eyes that it was. It is true. Because if you'd known I owned $67 million in real estate, you wouldn't have been celebrating my humility, you would have been asking for business advice. The accuracy of this observation was written across his face. I looked around at the assembled crowd, doctors, lawyers, politicians, business owners, all the people who had spent the evening assuming I was the least successful person at the party. Ladies and gentlemen, I said, raising my voice to address them all, I want to thank you for a very educational evening. You've shown me exactly how you treat people when you think they're beneath you professionally, and exactly how that treatment changes when you discover they're not. Jessica, Mrs. Pemberton started to say, we never thought. You never thought I was beneath you? Then why did every conversation tonight involve advice about starting small, learning the basics, and working my way up to more substantial properties? Why did everyone assume I needed guidance and encouragement to achieve what I'd already accomplished years ago? No one had an answer for that. The truth is, I continued, I've been watching this community for 7 years, studying how you treat people based on your assumptions about their success or failure. And what I've learned is that your respect isn't based on character or work ethic or integrity, it's based entirely on wealth and status. That's not fair, Dr. Martinez protested. We respect hard work and dedication. Do you? Because when you thought I was working hard at an entry-level job, you treated me like a charity case who needed encouragement. Now that you know I've been working hard at building a multimillion-dollar business, suddenly I'm someone whose opinions matter. The uncomfortable silence that followed suggested they knew I was right. My phone rang again. Another number I recognized as belonging to a business journalist. I declined the call, but it started ringing again immediately. I should probably take these, I said to the crowd. Apparently becoming the largest residential property owner in the county attracts media attention. I started toward the house, then stopped and turned back to my parents. Mom, Dad, I love you both. But I'm disappointed in you. I'm disappointed that you were more comfortable with the idea of me struggling than with the reality of me succeeding. I'm disappointed that you never asked the questions that would have revealed what I was actually building. And I'm disappointed that it took a phone call from my attorney to make you see me clearly. Mom was crying now, her perfectly applied makeup starting to streak. Jessica, please. Don't leave like this. We can fix this. We can do better. I hope so, I said. Because I've spent 7 years proving that your assumptions about me were wrong. The question now is whether you're capable of seeing me for who I actually am instead of who you expected me to be. I walked into the house and up to my childhood bedroom, closing the door behind me. Through the window I could see the anniversary party continuing in the garden below, though the energy had completely changed. Instead of celebrating my parents' achievements, everyone was discussing mine. My phone was buzzing constantly now with calls from reporters, business partners and other real estate professionals who had heard about the acquisition. The story was spreading quickly through our community and beyond. The young woman who had built a real estate empire while her own family thought she was learning basic property management. But as I sat in my old bedroom, looking out at the garden where I'd just revealed 7 years of hidden success, I realized I wasn't thinking about business or media attention or even the satisfaction of proving everyone wrong. I was thinking about the look on my parents' faces when they realized that their daughter, the one they'd been mildly embarrassed by and felt obligated to explain and defend, had achieved something extraordinary while they weren't paying attention. It wasn't the victory I'd imagined it would be. 2 hours later there was a soft knock on my bedroom door. "Jessica." Mom's voice was quiet, uncertain. "May I come in?" I opened the door to find both my parents standing in the hallway, looking older than I'd ever seen them. "We've been talking," Dad said. "For the past 2 hours, we've been talking about what happened tonight, about what we learned, about how badly we've handled everything. And we realized that our daughter has been more successful than we ever imagined, while we've been treating her like she needed our guidance to achieve what she'd already accomplished years ago," Mom said, fresh tears in her eyes. "They came into my room and sat on the bed where I'd spent countless hours as a child, dreaming about what I wanted to build with my life." $67 million, Dad said wonderingly. "Jessica, do you understand what you've accomplished? At 31, you've built something that most real estate developers spend entire careers trying to achieve." "I understand." "Then why didn't you tell us? Why let us go on thinking you were struggling when you were actually thriving?" I considered several possible answers but settled on the truth. "Because I needed to know if you could love me when you thought I wasn't successful." Dad flinched like I'd hit him. "Of course we love you. We've always loved you." "Have you? Because for 7 years, you've been slightly embarrassed by what you thought was my lack of achievement. You've been explaining me to your friends, making excuses for my choices, praising my work ethic while privately wishing I was more successful." "We were proud of your work ethic," Mom protested. "But you weren't proud of me. You were proud that I was trying, but you weren't proud of what you thought I was accomplishing." Neither of them could argue with that assessment. "The irony," I continued, "is that while you were wishing I could be more like your successful friends' children, I was actually more successful than most of them. I just didn't need you to know it." "Jessica," Dad said quietly, "I failed you as a father. I should have asked better questions, should have been more curious about your work, should have trusted that you were building something meaningful instead of assuming you were struggling. And I failed you as a mother," Mom added. "I was so focused on how your apparent lack of success reflected on our family that I never stopped to consider what you might actually be achieving." We sat in silence for several minutes, the weight of 31 years of assumptions settling between us. "What happens now?" Dad asked. "Now you know who I really am. What you do with that knowledge is up to you." "We want to know everything," Mom said urgently. "We want to understand what you've built, how you built it, what your plans are for the future. We want to be proud of you for the right reasons. And we want to support you properly," Dad added. "Not by offering advice you don't need or guidance you've already surpassed, but by being parents who understand and appreciate what their daughter has accomplished." I looked at these two people who had shaped so much of my life, who had driven me to succeed partly to earn their approval and partly to prove I didn't need it. "It's going to take time," I said finally. "We know. And you're going to have to see me clearly instead of seeing what you expect to see." "We will. And you can't use my success to make yourselves feel better about missing it for 7 years." Dad nodded. "We understand." 6 months later I was featured on the cover of Real Estate Weekly. The article was titled "The Stealth Empire: How Jessica Carter Built a Property Dynasty While Her Family Thought She Was Learning the Business." It told the story of my company, of the innovative approaches to residential development that had made me one of the youngest major property owners in the state, of the business philosophy that had turned a single duplex into an 800-unit empire. But it also told the story of my family, of the assumptions they'd made and how those assumptions had been shattered. It talked about the anniversary party revelation, about the years of misunderstanding, about the importance of seeing people for who they really are instead of who we expect them to be. The article included a photo of my parents and me standing in front of the Maple Street complex, all of us smiling genuinely as I showed them the latest renovations on the property that had made me the county's largest residential landlord. The caption read, "Robert and Margaret Carter learn about their daughter's real estate empire. We're finally getting to know the extraordinary businesswoman Jessica became while we weren't paying attention." It wasn't perfect. Relationships that had been built on false assumptions for years don't heal overnight. But it was honest, and it was real, and it was based on truth instead of expectations. And for the first time since I'd bought my first duplex, I felt like I could be proud of my success without having to hide it from the people who were supposed to love me most. The daughter they'd thought was learning property management had been managing to build an empire. And now, finally, they could see the difference.